Hello, I'm Diana Thomas.
And I'm Tom Harper.
Welcome to That Wilbur Smith Show,
a podcast about the historical, geographical, natural and human background to the world of Wilbur Smith.
There was movement below them on the plain. The torn canvas of an overturned wagon flapped like a wounded bird. The scurry and scuffle of the jackals, and higher up the slope of the kopje, the hunched-shouldered trot of a hyena. "Oh, my God," whispered Sean. And Biane leaned on his spear. His face was calm and withdrawn, but his eyes moved slowly over the field. Are they dead? Are they all dead? The question required no answer. He could see the dead men in the grass thick about the wagons, and then scattered more thinly back up the slope. They looked very small and inconsequential, and Biane stood quietly waiting. A big black Kolbe's vulture planed across their front. Feathers in its wingtips flated like the fingers of a spread hand. Its legs dropped, touched, and it hopped heavily to rest among the dead, a swift transformation from beautiful flight to obscene, crouching repose. It bobbed its head, ruffled its feathers, and waddled to dip its beak over a corpse that wore the green hunting tartan of the Gordons.
That was Wilbur Smith's description of the battlefield in the aftermath of Isandlwana in the Anglo Zulu War, which is the subject of our podcast today, as we know, the great inciting incident of when the lion feeds, when the Courtney family are sort of broken into different directions. So, in the last episode, we talked about the build-up to the Anglo Zulu War. Today, we're going to be discussing the two most famous battles of that war, Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift. And we're really fortunate to have again with us once more the historian and broadcaster, Professor Saul David, Professor of Military History at the University of Buckingham and author of the book Zulu, which was described by the Literary Review as the definitive history of the Zulu War. Saul, welcome back.
Thanks, guys. Love doing this.
So last time we discussed how the Zulu king Cetshwayo went to great pains to avoid a war, but the British administrators in South Africa, most notably Theophilus Shepstone and Sir Bartle Frere, these wonderfully evocative names, actually engineered the conflict for their own purposes so they could subdue the Zulus, break their power, and create a South African confederation. So what was the British strategy for achieving this in 1879? What was their war plan? And what went wrong at Isandlwana, leading to one of the worst defeats that the British Army and indeed the British Empire ever suffered?
Well, Chelmsford's overall strategy is to invade, Chelmsford being the British commander-in-chief, is to invade Zululand with 3 columns. And, in total, that's probably about 10,000 men. And the main column of roughly 4,500 to 5,000, it gets swelled because one of the other sub-columns joins it, comes across at Rorke's Drift, over the Buffalo River and into Zululand. And Chelmsford is convinced, as I've already suggested, that he's going to find it difficult to bring the Zulus to battle because he has such a technological superiority over them. And therefore, they're really going to, it's going to be a hit and run tactics. Why he thought that is still a mystery to me today, because he had a lot of people, Shepstone included, telling him, actually, no, this is the way they fight. This is what they're going to do. They are going to try and surround you, and they're going to come at you with an awful lot of people. Nevertheless, he felt 4,500 guys armed with very effective weapons. Admittedly, not all of those were Europeans. A big chunk of those were African levies who were of much less use, I suppose, on the battlefield, and traditional enemies, actually, of the Zulus. And you certainly see at Isandlwana examples of when coming up against their ancient foe, they decide that discretion is the better part of valor, and they leave the field of battle. But nevertheless, Chelmsford has a good chunk of people, British trained infantrymen. We're talking, professional soldiers here, armed with very effective weapons, and the total numbers, as I say, in the region of 4,500 to 5,000. Up against that is a Zulu army of 20,000. But what makes the battle winnable for the Zulus on the 22nd of January, 1879, is that Chelmsford not only has underestimated his enemy, he's now split his force. So he's gone away with effectively 2/3 of his force, and he's left 1,700 at the camp at Isandlwana, which he doesn't believe will be attacked. Meanwhile, of course, the Zulus have made this forced march, and how many of them are there? 20,000. So this is the main impi. There are more in the overall Zulu army, but this is the main impi, the main force of 20,000 incredibly disciplined, very brave warriors from everything from, teenagers all the way up to the older veterans would be in their late 30s and early 40s, but all very highly skilled warriors capable of marching great distances. And although they're not horsed, they are capable of covering a lot of ground very quickly. And on the morning of the 22nd of January, as I say, Chelmsford made the fatal decision to split his force because he has intelligence that the Zulus are at one place where they are not, of course. And this, I should add at this point, is often felt, well, this is all about Chelmsford's incompetence, the defeat at Isandlwana. In reality, the Zulus played the game very cleverly because they deliberately lured him using scouts and using smaller groups of Zulus away from the camp to the Mangeni Falls, which is to the southeast of the camp, whereas the main Zulu MP was in the northeast. And so the attack, when it took place, was a complete surprise to those soldiers who'd been left in the camp, who'd just basically been given very vague orders to defend the camp if the Zulus come in sight, which is what they try and do, but they don't have enough soldiers ultimately.
What was the Zulu plan? What were their tactics?
So the tactics that were used by the Zulus at the Battle of Isandlwana were very similar to Shaka's tactics, which is the horns of the buffalo. The main chest of the Zulu army, 20,000 strong, comes up against the main defenses of the camp. Meanwhile, the two horns of the buffaloes are racing all the way around the camp. Now, for a brief time, the gunfire, in particular of the horsed men defending the camp, Durnford's horsemen, stops one of the horns, but eventually they get overwhelmed, driven back into the camp, and the camp is completely surrounded. It's then hand-to-hand fighting, which of course is what the Zulus excel at, using their stabbing spears. And every single man who doesn't manage to escape from the camp, and that's 1,350 of them, are killed. Most of them then have their stomachs opened, which is why it's such a charnel house, such a brutal scene to see for those who come afterwards. You read that wonderful description of Courtney coming across the Isandlwana battlefield, and that is a scene that no doubt he's taken from actual reporters, soldiers who also came upon the battlefield. Not until a couple of months later, actually, because so shocking was the defeat at Isandlwana that everyone stayed very much at arm's length from the Zulus. They were really, the whole of the British force that was in shock, actually, at what had happened. But in any case, when they got to the battlefield, the sight, even 2 months later, even with the decomposition of the bodies, was still an absolutely horrific sight of seeing these bodies that had been effectively eviscerated and cut to pieces. So that type of warfare really sends a shiver down your enemy and is an added layer of effectiveness, I suppose, for your armed forces.
And dare I ask, were there any survivors?
A few people get away. Maybe 200 or 300 survive the attack, but everyone else dies. And it's interesting, of the 1,000 British infantrymen, mainly from the 24th Foot, who are present at Isandlwana, 95% of them lose their lives. So it's an absolute bloodbath. And the Zulus don't take prisoners, and pretty much everyone is opened up, as we've already described, with the terrible Ikloa stabbing spear.
Once the infantryman has fired his bullet from his Martini Henry rifle, if the Zulu can get close enough before he has time to reload, the odds suddenly shift absolutely in favor of the Zulu. So in other words, you have to keep them at a distance, because once they're close, they're going to beat you. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, the British infantrymen also had bayonets, which they would use as a matter of last resort. And you could take on a Zulu with his short stabbing spear with your bayonet. And the British infantrymen were very effective with bayonets. But it's really a question of numbers. You're absolutely right, Diana. The trick in this battle was to keep them at a distance. And as soon as they got close, it was going to be all over. And there's one particularly sort of grim moment where one of the companies of British infantry withdraw because they're under so much pressure and they can't load quickly enough. There is a bit of a myth about the battle, actually, that they ran out of ammunition. That's not the case. They even a lot of the bodies that they found, the archaeology they did years later, they can see piles of unused ammunition. So it's not that they completely ran out of ammunition. It's just that they couldn't load quickly enough. They were forced back into the camp, and once you're on the move, trying to load and fire when you're on the move, and you don't have your fellow infantrymen protecting you all around you, it was really, there was no chance for the survivors at that point. And of course, as I've already explained, the Zulus are rampaging in from the back of the camp as well as from the front of the camp, and there was no chance really for those on foot to escape. Most of the Europeans who do get away because they're on horses.
So the Zulus have overwhelmed the camp. I think we've not described probably the most visually striking feature of this battlefield, which is the actual mountain of Isandlwana itself. Because it's described as a mountain in Wilbur's book. I think it's more of it's like a sort of a rock. It's a copy, isn't it? Effectively.
Yeah, it's a relatively small, sort of 500 feet high, but it's very distinctive. It's set in kind of rolling plains. Anyone who's seen the setting, it's incredibly beautiful landscape, actually, with lots of little hidden valleys all over the place. But this sphinx-like, I mean, it's described as a sphinx, and when you see pictures of it, you can see why they felt it was sphinx-like. And it's ironic, actually, that the emblem of the regiment that fought and died at Isandlwana is a sphinx, because they had got that battle honor fighting in Egypt in 1800, and it was almost as though they were fated eventually to meet their maker, as it were, at this extraordinary mountain. But one of the reasons that they chose to camp in its lee really is because it was so distinctive. It was kind of a point that you could say, well, this is where we are, but also there was plenty of firewood and also water in the vicinity, and it made a perfect camping ground.
Yeah. And in When the Lion Feeds, as Sean Courtney picks his way over the battlefield, he sees where his father's unit have fallen, gradually retreating up the mountain. And then when he gets right to the very top of it, is where he finds his father. Now, again, it was an incredibly vivid image of almost like the tide rising up the mountain, and they're retreating until they can go no further, and they're cornered. Again, is that historically accurate, that people kind of retreat up this mountain trying to find safety?
It is, and he's based that sequence of events really on the retreat of Durnford. I mentioned Durnford once before. Durnford was used actually as the scapegoat for the defeat at Isandlwana by Chelmsford. Chelmsford insisted that Durnford was given orders to stay and defend the camp. Not true, as we discovered, that is, historians later discovered the actual order, and it never said anything about taking command of the camp. It just ordered him and his horsemen to come towards the camp, and it was Durnford who, as I've already pointed out, managed to prevent one of the horns from getting fully surrounding the camp for a considerable period of time. They did have a little bit of trouble with ammunition, actually, not so much the British infantrymen, but Durnford's men, and they withdrew. So under Durnford's command were a lot of white settlers, which is where the Sean Courtney's father bit comes into the story, or at least, that you could say, well, he's part of one of those rough riding groups.
Yeah, he's part of like they're called a commando, I think. The Cape Volunteers or something they're called, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And all of that is true. And so Durnford is generally considered to have led the last stand. And they went further and further and further up the mountain. Although, interestingly, it's not. They didn't go up the mountain of Isandlwana itself, mainly because it's incredibly steep and it would have been difficult to have negotiated it. What they did is they maneuvered up to the top of something called the Stony Kopje, which was another bit of high ground directly opposite the actual mountain of Isandlwana, or the hill of Isandlwana, and in between is the famous saddle over which a number of Europeans fled to get away, and also finally where the Zulu impis, the two horns of the buffalo, met when they finally surrounded the camp. So all of that is absolutely true, and he has based that on historical fact, that withdrawal of Durnford and his horsemen to the Stony Kopje, where all of them perished.
Yeah, well, I didn't realise it quite that historically close to fact.
One of the big criticisms of the Battle of Isandlwana is that the camp wasn't properly entrenched. They didn't build a laager of wagons, which is what the Boers had always recommended, and they didn't build an entrenchment, which is what the Europeans were doing in other similar situations. So, having learnt that lesson, they made pretty sure that the Zulus were never going to get that close again.
Circling the wagons. I mean, that's what you do if you're crossing the Great Plains and you're frightened of Native Americans.
Yeah.
And it's what the Boers learned to do when they were crossing the veldt. And it's what the British should have done, but didn't do. So there you go.
There was a lot of criticism after the battle, mainly directed by Chelmsford onto the defenders of the camp for not having circled the wagons. First point, he never left any orders for them to circle the wagons. And the orders he did actually leave, and again, these were discovered by historians years later, were in the event of an attack, you will set out the defenses like this. Nothing about the wagons, but you will put the infantry in the forward defensive positions well away from the camp. And it's interesting, he actually specified well away from the camp. Why? To give them clear lines of fire. And again, a sign of complete overconfidence that they're going to be able to take down the Zulus at a great distance. And then on either side of that defensive position, you put both the cavalry, that's Durnford's men, if you've got cavalry. There weren't always cavalry with the armed forces as they were coming in, or the British and settler armed forces. But if you had cavalry, you put them on the flanks, and you also put the African levies on the flanks as well, where they would, in effect, not potentially get into as much trouble as if they were in the front line, and of course that could be broken. So those were the tactics he insisted on.
Just to get back to we've got the two forces, each seeking land, one moving south, that's the Zulu, and one moving north, that's the British. And one of them is incredibly mightily equipped, and the other is equipped with relatively primitive weapons. And it's kind of reminiscent of the white settlers coming across Northern America. And it's interesting that Isandlwana takes place just 3 years after Little Bighorn, which is a very similar case of a native army destroying supposedly better armed, colonialist, I guess you would say, white army. And the question arises, how did they do it? I mean, was it just the incompetence or carelessness you've just described of Chelmsford not taking appropriate precautions, arrogance, I suppose, on his point? Or was there something else about the way they fought which took the British Army by surprise and taught them a lesson they wouldn't forget?
Well, I mean, there's sort of two elements to that question. The first, one of the interesting, it is a very interesting historical parallel, actually. The native Indians in North America had a big advantage over the Zulus fighting the British for two reasons, actually. One, the number of soldiers they came up against. This, of course, is the famous last stand of Custer and the 7th Cavalry at Little Bighorn, was much smaller. We're only talking about a few hundred as opposed to almost 2,000 in the case of 1,750 in the case of Isandlwana. So you can see that the European force was much bigger at Isandlwana, and therefore the Zulus had a much tougher challenge. But the other advantage that the Native Americans had over the 7th Cavalry and Custer, and there was all this hubris of overconfidence, and I can go in there and I can take them out with a relatively small force from Custer's side. But the Native Americans were mounted, which meant that they were much more mobile, and they were also equipped with more effective weapons. So we talked about the fact that the Zulus hardly used firearms, or at least if they did, they were pretty basic, and then they it was a one-shot weapon. Whereas the Native Americans actually were equipped, a lot of them, with repeating firearms, which they got, again, off unscrupulous traders. And they'd been spending an awful lot of time getting their hands on some pretty good kit. So they were much better equipped than the Zulus were in terms of the sort of technological challenge they would have to face. There was, of course, in the US Army at that time, Gatling guns and the other things that I've spoken about that the British had, but generally speaking, they didn't have them in this campaign because it was a long distance horsed campaign. And really, in the end, by the time you got to Little Bighorn, it was really just a question of horse soldiers armed with pretty decent weapons against horse soldiers with equally decent weapons, and just a lot more of them. So that defeat is much more explicable, I think, in that sense, and it makes the victory of the Zulus at Isandlwana a much greater achievement, in my view.
So the bulk of Chelmsford's column has been destroyed. The British have been soundly defeated at Isandlwana, and the day isn't over yet, because I think the most extraordinary thing is that another battle, another equally legendary and evocative battle, is fought on the very same day. So let's move on now to Rorke's Drift, which, if not exactly a victory for the British, was certainly spun as a mighty, heroic engagement in which the Zulus had been seen off. Which Wilbur, of course, captures brilliantly well. So here is Wilbur's snapshot of Garrick Courtney's experience at Rorke's Drift from When the Lion Feeds. There had been a Zulu with the blue heron feathers of an Induna in his headdress. He had led the charge. His shield was dried oxhide, dappled black and white, and at his wrists and ankles were bunches of war rattles. Garrick had fired at the instant the Zulu half turned to beckon to his warriors. The bullet sliced across the tensed muscles of his belly and unzipped it like a purse. The Zulu went down on his hands and knees, with his entrails bulging out in a pink and purple mess. The wounded Zulu started to crawl towards Garrick, his mouth moving and his eyes fastened on Garrick's face. He still had the assegai in his hand. The other Zulus were beating at the door, and one of them ran his spear blade through a crack in the woodwork and lifted the bar. The door was open.
So that reading was taken from When the Lion Feeds description of the Battle of Rorke's Drift as seen or not seen by Garrick Courtney. And I guess the first question to ask is, how did the conflict move from the first battle at Isandlwana down to Rorke's Drift? What was the sequence of events?
Well, the distance between the two battlefields was 11 miles, and there's one crucial component of the Zulu army, the Zulu Impi, that is not involved in the Battle of Isandlwana because it's not required, and that is the reserve. So, in effect, every Zulu army has a chest, two horns of the buffaloes, and the loins, or reserve as it's known. And of course, you bring in the reserve in an emergency if you haven't managed to break through and beat your enemy with the first three elements. Well, they had managed to do that at Isandlwana. So the reserve is left having not fought anyone, and they're pretty keen to get into the fray. And they hear word that there is a mission station just across the Natal border over the Buffalo River at Rorke's Drift, where indeed Chelmsford's army has come from in the first place, and that this is easy pickings. It's effectively a supply station. There'll be grain, there'll be ammunition, other things that the Zulus can get their hands on. It will, in effect, be an invasion of Natal, but only briefly. That's the plan. So you get across the river, you take the mission station, you sack it, you kill anyone defending it, and then you move off. So that's pretty much what was going on. There were no specific orders, certainly not from Chichwaya, the king, to cross into Natal. And he says after the campaign is all over, and the Zulus, of course, have been defeated, that, this was a big mistake, and he never gave those orders. So it's the individual commander in charge of the reserve of the Zulu army who decides to attack Rorke's Drift. The only problem he's got is that Rorke's Drift is a mission station with a church effectively attached to it. They set up these two buildings in effect as a supply station. And in the gap between the Zulu Impi deciding to go to Rorke's Drift and actually getting there and attacking the position, the commanders at Rorke's Drift, two lieutenants, Chard and Bromhead, famous from the film Zulu, have made the decision, encouraged by one of their, effectively an NCO, a man called Dalton, to create a little fortified position. So they use mealie bags and biscuit tins and wagons to join up the two buildings into what is in effect a mini fortress. And by the time the Zulus arrive, and what are the numbers we're talking about? Roughly 3,000 Zulus, about 100 fit soldiers. That's basically a company of British soldiers, and another 35 people who'd been left at Rorke's Drift to recover from wounds and illness and other things. So you're only talking about 140 defenders, but the position has been so heavily fortified that they were able to use their Martini Henrys and other weapons very effectively against the attacking Zulus. And the Zulus attack in a series of rushes. Really, they are relatively uncoordinated, and if they'd all come in one big attack from multiple different directions, they probably would have succeeded. But as you see the battle unfold over a number of hours, towards the afternoon of the 22nd of January 1879, on into the night, it's a sort of a 2-day battle. It goes almost all through the night. They do nibble away at bits of the defenses. They get into the building that's been used as the hospital, where a lot of dramatic fighting is going on, all of which has been very sort of heavily sourced by the people involved in the fighting. And a lot of the Victoria Cross winners were people who helped in the defense of the hospital. The Zulus do manage to get into that position, but the defenders of Rorke's Drift pull back into an even tighter, almost in effect an inner redoubt. And it's that inner redoubt that is never penetrated by the Zulus. And then in the morning, they realize they can't take the position and they withdraw, having incurred horrific casualties. Something like 500, we think, were killed in the attack on Rorke's Drift. It's really brutal. And a number of wounded Zulus are then killed by the Redcoats afterwards. They're sort of lying in the orchard and various positions surrounding the mission station, and they are killed out of hand. Considered to be after the event a bit of a war atrocity, which no doubt it was, but it was pretty brutal warfare from both sides. It needs to be said.
To what extent? I mean, you mentioned the film, which everybody of a certain generation, certainly every British person of a certain generation, knows all too well. It's kind of like The Great Escape. It's one of those films you can't avoid, really. I mean, it's an absolutely famous sort of historical epic, and there's Michael Caine turning himself into a superstar before your very eyes. How accurate is the film in its depiction of what went on? I mean, is it over-dramatized, or is it in fact exactly pretty much what happened?
I actually appeared on a podcast which was really about matching films with historical events, and I answered that question in a lot of detail. And I'll give you a shorter version now, but it is incredibly accurate, actually. Certainly the beats of the story, the way the battle unfolds, the arrival of the Zulus, the setting up of the defensive position, even the moments of the battle, those crucial moments when the Zulus do eventually get into the hospital. They get into it, actually, by setting it on fire, which drives the defenders out, and they eventually take possession of that of the hospital. All of that is depicted in the order it actually happened in the film Zulu, and it's all depicted very accurately. The big thing I have issue with in relation to the film is the depiction of Chard and Bromhead as the architects of the defense. Now, these are the two officers who later win the Victoria Cross, or awarded the Victoria Cross. But here's a significant fact which you might not be aware of, Diana, that in the immediate aftermath of the battle, you always have, the first thing that happens after a big engagement with the British Army is that the senior people then give their recommendations for gallantry medals. There was no mention of Chard and Bromhead in those initial recommendations. They were added to the list. They were all NCOs and privates who were recommended for the Victoria Cross, 6 of them. And they were added to the list by Chelmsford. And I think he did that because he wanted to say, this is a wonderful example of officer-led defense. And here's the important part, it's going to obscure the disaster at Isandlwana. So if we build up Rorke's Drift into having saved Natal, which is what they claimed, not true, but they claimed it. And if we say that we're going to give out 8 Victoria Crosses, as it happens, 11 were eventually given out. So there were another 3 added to the list, one of which went to Dalton, the man I mentioned before, who is, in my view, the real hero, because not only did Dalton prevent Chard Bromhead from abandoning the post, which is what they wanted to do. He was the guy who actually said, no, we need to set it up. We need to set up the defences in this way. And he also led the defence. And you see from some of the contemporary documents that the reason that Chard and Bromhead were left at Rorke's Drift and were not with the main column, which was, of course, assumed to be doing all the fighting, was because they weren't the most effective officers. So they weren't the brightest pair. And Dalton's actions will show you, in my view, that he was the real hero of the action. So they were sort of added to the list. Now, you don't get any of that in the film. They absolutely play the straight card. It's these two guys who designed the defense and lead the defense. And but that's my only caveat. The rest of the story is depicted very accurately.
Well, that's. I mean, I think in your book, there's another detail which I feel we have to highlight, which you say, contrary to the impression given by the iconic film Zulu, B Company, so the Redcoats, were not dominated by Welshmen, liable to break into a rendition of Men of Harlech at the first opportunity. You've absolutely shattered my illusions there.
Yeah, I must admit, I felt a little bit guilty about putting that in the book. I was actually born and brought up in Monmouthshire. So this is a question of statistics, damn statistics. It is absolutely true that the 24th Foot was really a Warwickshire regiment at that time. Later became the South Wales Borderers. So that's the kind of that's the story of the regiment. But nevertheless, there were a number of people from Monmouthshire within the 24th Foot. The point is, in those days, Monmouthshire was not considered to be part of Wales. It now is. So we're really splitting hairs here. This is kind of border country. Most of these guys were from either Wales, Monmouthshire, and/or the cities of Birmingham and the Midlands. But they certainly weren't all Welshmen. I think they give the idea in the film that this is really a Welsh regiment. It was going to become a Welsh regiment. It had Welsh in it, but not the sort of proportion that they were implying on the film.
So, of course, one of the main characters in the film is Hookie, who's this malingerer and scrounger and thoroughly bad person who ends up being a hero, an unexpected hero who wins the VC. Is that an actual character, or is that a sort of another fictional change?
Well, Hook is a real person, and the actions that they ascribe him in the film, he actually carried out. He was in the hospital. He managed to save a lot of lives in the hospital. He's the guy who leads the movement from one room to another. You get that very dramatic scene in the film where they're literally breaking through the walls into the next room, and in the next room they find some more wounded, and then they lead them into the next room. Hook was absolutely crucial in all of that. The misdirection in the film is by making out that Hook was some kind of drunkard who was on, who was in the hospital really because he was being given the job of effectively. He was under house arrest because he was a malingerer, as you say, and a typical ne'er-do-well. Not true at all. He had an absolutely spotless record. He was from Gloucestershire. Again, you see this kind of border territory link between Monmouthshire and Gloucestershire. And he was, most important detail to remember, he was a teetotal. So he couldn't possibly have been this sort of drunkard that they depicted in the film. And interestingly enough, the premiere of the film, to which all Hook's descendants were invited, they were so upset with the depiction of their ancestor as this ne'er-do-well that they walked out of the premiere. So it's an extra bit of information. I mean, I forgive the producers, frankly, and the director and the writer that sort of liberty because they wanted to turn him into a sort of typical ne'er-do-well. That's fine. I mean, the actions which he carried out were absolutely, and that's what is much more important to me, what he actually did to win his VC.
This goes right back to your point you made right at the beginning of our conversation about when you stop being a historian and you start being a creative writer. It's a much more interesting character arc if the person who turns out to be a hero starts out as anything but a hero. It makes him much more interesting than if he's just a hero all the time. So, of course, from the scriptwriter's point of view, that's an entirely natural thing to do. But equally, from the family's point of view, for whom he's a real person or was a real person, I can just imagine why they'd want to walk out. But I'm afraid to say that if you're writing fiction, then it's just tough luck.
Yeah, someone needs to have a word with the family and say, there will be some liberties taken with characterization. It is tricky when you're manipulating the background and character of a real person. That's absolutely true. We've all faced the issue when we're writing fiction. My view is, and I remember MacDonald Fraser saying this to me too when I oddly enough have had the how would you put it? The sort of, the privilege, I suppose, of being the last journalist. I mean, I was writing writing a piece for the Daily Telegraph to interview MacDonald Fraser, and he said to me, "Look, stick true to the spirit of the person, but you have to, if you want to really manipulate history, then you have to make up characters as your central characters. But when you're dealing with real people, stick true to their spirit." I think that's what he said. Did they do that with Hook? Possibly not. But his actions were nevertheless depicted very accurately, I thought.
Of course, the way the Wilbur gets around this is he has Garrick Courtney there, who is luckily a completely fictional character. And I was amused when you were talking about the inflation of Victoria Cross citations, because it went from 6 to 8 to 11. When the Lion feeds, actually, Garrick is told that there have been 15 citations for the old VC. And I assume this is Wilbur having a bit of a joke, because, of course, one of the citations that's been added is actually Garrick Courtney himself. Has been added to that list of people who get the VC for his actions defending the hospital. So he said this is presumably one of the crucial moments of the battle where the Zulus break into the hospital. And in the book, Garrick, this brilliant moment of kind of unwitting heroism, trips and his arm jams in the bolts of the door, and his arm is effectively being the bar that holds the door shut as the Zulus hammer on it. And as a result, the other residents of the hospital are able to get to safety. I mean, is there anything like that happens, or is this Wilbur letting his imagination run riot?
Yeah, no, that's definitely Wilbur taking a bit of artistic license, but again, with a character, with a completely made up character. If he does that with one of the guys who actually was in the hospital, Hook and others, you would hope that he's not going to sort of make up the scenarios. But no, I think that the defense of the hospital is one of those. The whole of Rorke's Drift is a classic Last Stand, Thermopylae type battle. The Alamo. I mean, there are many of them, but the hospital fighting was a microcosm of that. It was a battle within a battle, and it's incredibly dramatic because it involves a few fit men basically saving a lot of injured characters, people who were unwell. One guy's delirious. I mean, I think they leave the delirious guy there. Actually, he's killed, and I know they depict that quite accurately in the film Zulu. But it absolutely lends to inserting a fictional character, which of course is what I've done in my own book Zulu Heart, where my protagonist George fights in the hospital as well as a sort of supernumerary, and yet alongside that, a lot of the fighting that actually took place I depict quite accurately, or at least try to.
Of course, Flashman was there as well. So I'm imagining that Flashman, George Hart, and Garrick Courtney all getting together and having a chat. Someone needs to write the fan fiction of this.
Yeah, well, that's why it went up to 15 VCs, because George also.
Yeah.
We're talking about it as fiction, but I mean, very quickly, Rorke's Drift became legend, became myth. I mean, how fast was it that the kind of idea of Rorke's Drift, and how needed was it? As you say, I mean, Chelmsford needed to cover up for the defeat of Isandlwana. I should imagine that the government was only too grateful for an example of British heroism when there'd been an example of British failure. And I mean, and it's absolute catnip to the sort of burgeoning Fleet Street press. I mean, how fast was the process of Rorke's Drift becoming mythologized?
Incredibly quickly, and as you've sort of suggested, it was needed. It was very much needed. These two battles took place on the same day. One was an utter disaster that compares with anything, any military disaster in British military history, actually, but certainly in the Victorian period. And the only competitors are battles like Maiwand, which took place in Afghanistan a year later, in fact, in 1880. And then you have to go all the way back to the retreat from Kabul, probably, to find another disaster that could compare. And the shock to the system for the British public was such that they were absolutely looking out for anything that could kind of leaven the effect of that and still make them feel a little bit good about themselves about a British feat of arms. So Rorke's drift was incredibly fortuitous, but it was undoubtedly exaggerated both by the commanders in South Africa and also by the politicians at home, again to deflect from their responsibility for what had been frankly a war of aggression, and a war of aggression that had started very badly with this humiliating defeat. So there's one particularly telling quote from Chelmsford where he writes to one of the officers who's writing the report of Rorke's drift and says, please tell me it's finished, because I'm desperate to send that little gleam of sunshine, as he described it in his letter, as at home as quickly as possible. And of course, waiting back home was Disraeli, the Prime Minister, or Lord Beaconsfield as he had become, who also was looking to get some good news to deflect the political sort of fallout from the defeat at Isandlwana. Not to be underestimated, the effect that the setbacks during the Zulu War, ultimately won by the British, of course, but the initial setbacks had on him in a political sense. So he was desperate to get that news, and they were trumpeting it in Parliament and exaggerating, as I've already suggested, the effect of the battle by saying it effectively saves Natal, when that simply wasn't the case. They gave out more VCs for Rorke's drift than have ever been awarded for any single action in the history of the British Army. And given that there are only, as I've already pointed out, 140 soldiers defending it, you see that the VC strike rate is over 10%. I mean, it's ludicrously high. Never got even close in any other instance. And that will give you an indication of how determined they were to build it up into being something it really wasn't. It was a border skirmish that was won by a group of determined but not particularly heroic defenders. And when I say not particularly heroic, by that, I want to quote Wolsey, who's the commander who was sent out to replace Chelmsford not long after Rorke's drift, who says, well, of course they fought tenaciously. They were like rats in a trap. We'd have all done the same thing. And I think that really puts it into context, where the people who, if I'm going to give one caveat, the people who deserved the VCs were the people who rather heroically at least risked their lives to save the people in the hospital, but everybody else, including the two officers, I'm not so sure.
So there's another kind of little detail from When the Lion Feeds at Rorke's drift that I just want to ask you about, Saul, because Wilbur, as Garrick is remembering being there, he talks about the clustered barrels of the Gatling machine gun jumped as they swung, cutting down the Zulus so they fell upon each other thick along the wall. I have to say, I did not see Gatling guns in the movie. Are there Gatling guns at Rorke's drift? I know it's a small point, but I'm curious.
No, there are not. There were Gatling guns, as I think I've indicated, in the war as a whole, because they were used at Ulundi. They were also used at one of the battles in southern Zululand, Gingunlovu, as it was known, which was fought by another column. But they didn't have them at Rorke's drift for the very good reason that the Gatling guns were considered to be offensive weapons. They didn't have many of them, and they were therefore with the columns that had actually invaded into Zululand. Although, again, interestingly enough, they weren't at Isandlwana either, because the force that had marched out under Chelmsford on the morning of the 22nd had taken the Gatling guns with them. So So this is an error which I sort of forgive, because they could have been at Rorke's drift. It's just for reasons of military tactics, I suppose, more than anything else. They were actually up with the forces that were inside Zululand and not being used in a defensive sense at Rorke's drift.
I always think it's maybe Wilbur doing a little bit of homage to his grandfather as well, the original Courtney Smith, who I think, Diana, I think knows more about this, but I think what did actually work transporting Gatling guns for the army in the Zulu War.
Yeah, I think that's all told in on Leopard Rock, isn't it? The story of yeah. And who was, of course, a huge hero to the young Wilbur. So I think, again, a fiction writer is entitled to take their own personal influences and the things that have meant a huge amount to them in their lives and weave it into their stories. I mean, that's kind of what we're supposed to do.
We'll forgive the Gatling guns, because I forgive the Gatling gun addition to the Rorke's drift story for the simple fact that they did have those weapons in the invading armies at the time. It just so happened that they weren't at Rorke's drift, but they existed and they were being used.
That's actually a very interesting point in terms of historical fiction. There is absolutely a qualitative difference between something that could have happened, even if it didn't happen, and something that could never possibly have happened. And I think you can. I think a writer of historical fiction can, and indeed contemporary fiction, actually, if you're writing a thriller or something, you have a hero do some wildly improbable thing. If somebody who knows about the subject says, "Well, it didn't actually happen, but it could have done," that's always good enough for me. Whereas if they say, "No, that's impossible. It would never. That's just simply couldn't possibly have happened," then equally that's a kind of red line. So, score one for Wilbur.
So we've had Isandlwana, which is a terrible defeat. We've had Rorke's Drift, which is a morale-boosting but probably fairly inconsequential victory. Where does that leave the progress of the war?
There are various other engagements that the other columns are involved in. They are effectively defensive victories. There are no more defeats for the British. But Chelmsford's really the key to the rest of the story, because having eventually got back to Isandlwana and seen the kind of charnel house of all the dead bodies lying on the field of battle, he withdraws across the river to Rorke's Drift, again sees the destroyed hospital, but realizes that they've made quite an effective stand there. And of course, that's what starts on his, we can use Rorke's Drift to take away from Isandlwana. But he's also absolutely convinced that when he goes back into, when he reinvades Zululand, and he does that a couple of months later, he's going to do so with such a large force, and a force that takes no chances. In other words, every night it's going to create effectively a fort around it. It's going to dig entrenchments and it's going to bed itself in. That when the Zulus do eventually come out to fight, which they do as he's nearing the capital of Ulundi, it's going to be a very one-sided fight. And that's exactly what happens. So Ulundi, as the final battle, takes place in early July 1879. It's a catastrophic defeat for the Zulus. Hardly any European lives are lost in that battle. And to give you a sense of the superiority of the Europeans by that point, they have Gatling guns, they have artillery, and they also have cavalry, which they use to pursue the defeated Zulus. And that's really the end. A month later, Cetshwayo, the Zulu king himself, is captured, sent into exile, and Zululand is broken up into a number of smaller statelets that the British assume, using their typical practice of divide and rule, will be much easier to control Zululand. Actually, it's the start of a period of civil war, internecine fighting between the various Zulu factions that is only brought to an end when Cetshwayo is brought back from exile. He lives for a couple of years and then dies. And finally, Zululand itself is completely subsumed by the British when they annex it, which they had, at least claimed they didn't want to do, but they finally do that in 1887, and that's sort of the end of the story. There is some more trouble in years to come with people trying to resurrect the Zulu kingdom, but that's really the end of the Anglo Zulu War story.
And what happens to the Zulu people themselves? I mean, do they presumably retain their identity of themselves and the history of themselves, culture?
Absolutely, and to this day, of course, they look back on that time as a disaster for their nation, but it didn't destroy their culture. They are now, I think, statistically, the biggest single subgrouping of Bantu in Southern Africa. So, and they play an inordinately powerful role in South African politics, as we saw during the end of the apartheid era. And also since the black majority rule, the Zulu vote has always been a real key factor in politics. So they are big players in Southern African politics to this day, and their culture still looks back on the victory at Isandlwana with huge pride, and of course the later defeats with being a tragedy for their nation.
Yeah, in fact, I visited the battlefield of Isandlwana. I think it was a day or two before the anniversary in January 2020. And there's a massive marquee set up because the king was going to come on the anniversary and hold effectively a rally with a large number of his kind of Zulu subjects, because this was still seen as such a great victory and a really sort of potent symbol of kind of Zulu power and resistance. So yeah, even to this day, it's got a lot of resonance.
When the BBC made a documentary on the battle, the twin battles of Rorke's Drift and Isandlwana about 20 years ago, we we did a lot of filming on the actual battlefield itself, and we used a lot of the locals to appear as extras effectively in fighting the battle. And lo and behold, they all had the right kit. I mean, they looked absolutely as they would have done in the 19th century with their kilts and their spears and all, and their headdresses. It was absolutely extraordinary. We had more of 100 of them, and you might think, well, you got to go to some costume department to get all of that kit. No, absolutely, they have that stuff still to this day. Still wear those sort of uniforms and dresses for ceremonial occasions, for rallies, and so it is still a very live bit of history in Zulu culture, the story of the Anglo Zulu War.
And I mean, I suppose that's also to go back right to the beginning. Why are the Zulu the kind of iconic African tribe? It's because they did win. I mean, it's because they actually did score that victory, and because even when in the public mind they were beaten or at least held off. I mean, it's interesting in the film of Zulu. It's very much stated. I don't know how accurately, that the attack ceases the following morning after the sort of when dawn comes up, not because the Zulu have been defeated, but because, in the way the film tells it, they're doing it as a mark of honor to the defendants. It's okay, you've put up this fantastic fight. We respect you as warriors. We are going to choose to leave the battlefield. We have not been beaten. And so they do have, I suppose, because of the film, because the name is so cool. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it is Zulu. It's a NATO letter after all. It's part of our culture. They've retained this kind of completely iconic status because of these great warriors, because they could beat a modern army.
Yes, it's absolutely true, and they are seen in the we go all the way back. I sort of briefly kind of hinted at it in one of my earlier comments. You go all the way back to the Spartans. I mean, the Zulus were known as the Black Spartans. They are very similar in terms of their culture and their military prowess, and that I'm afraid, as long as mankind still fights wars, and of course we're in the middle of a pretty grim war in Europe at the moment. The warrior cult will still be significant, and it still is. There's still tremendous respect, I suspect, and probably fear, and maybe a little bit of other attitudes towards the Zulus in South Africa today, because they are not only a political force, they're a kind of they're kind of physical force that you have to be aware of.
And I think the other thing that's interesting in terms of the historical memory is that we've talked about three battles effectively. We've talked about Isandlwana, Rorke's Drift, and Ulundi. When we were talking before the program with our producer Christopher, he was saying that obviously he'd heard of Rorke's Drift, very famous. Hadn't heard of Isandlwana, and probably many people haven't, but students of that period will have done. I'll have to admit that. Even as myself, someone who, like you, has been fascinated by this period and the subject for a long, long time, I'd never heard of the Battle of Ulundi until I really started looking into this in a very deep way. I mean, that's one that's completely forgotten. So it's like, we're happy to remember the defeat. We're happy to, we're more than happy to remember the glorious kind of survival against the odds. But the one where we actually duff them up, losing 13 men against however many thousands of theirs we kill, actually we sort of sweep that under the rug. It's almost like we're embarrassed. So in the popular imagination, the Zulus haven't actually been defeated.
No, I know. But the lesson, of course, to learn, certainly if you're a historian trying to find a good subject, is you've got to have jeopardy. Jeopardy works in fiction, as we all know. I mean, it's absolutely crucial in fiction. And I think non-fiction writers can really learn from the best fiction writers because you have to be telling a story that could go either way. Now, a lot of history is genuinely contingent. I mean, there but for this, it could have been that. But there was no contingency with the Battle of Ulundi, and therefore it's a sort of non-starter. We're almost not proud of it because it was so one-sided. There is no sort of credit to get. No one got a VC for Ulundi.
Once Chelmsford has worked out the sheer brute force required to defeat them, there's simply no way they can possibly beat the sheer weight of materiel that's put up against them. And it's just not humanly possible.
The significance of the Zulu War, in my view, is it was unwinnable for the Zulus, of course, against the might of the British Empire. But they had to engage, and they had to have some success. So which is why the Battle of Isandlwana is so important for the Zulu nation to this day. It's almost Clausewitzian to accept that you are going to go down as a nation, but the way you go down is important. You can't just submit, which is why, going back to my earlier comments, they could never have agreed to that that humiliation of literally laying down their weapons and demilitarizing their nation. It simply wasn't possible for them. So you go down fighting, and this allows a rebirth.
Yeah. So there we have the end of the Anglo Zulu War. Of course, it's not the end of Sean Courtney's story, because as a result of what's happened at Isandlwana, with his father dying, and at Rorke's Drift with his brother becoming a war hero, he will then strike out across the mountains to seek his fortune at a place called Witwatersrand, which will be the subject of our next episode. But for now, we're going to leave it, and we're going to say goodbye to Saul David. Thank you so much, Saul, for joining us. It's been an absolute delight having you.
Thanks, guys.
And of course, if you'd like to learn more about Saul and his many books, you could check out his website, which is sauldavid.co.uk. Sauldavid, all one word, .co.uk. And you could check out his own podcast called Battleground Ukraine, which he co-hosts with Patrick Bishop. You've written your book about military blunders, so of which there are plenty to choose from. So hopefully we'll have something else to talk to you about at some point in the future.
Absolutely. Come back soon. That Wilbur Smith Show is produced by Christopher Wynne.
Music by Dewey DeLay.